Well, welcome back to the Comic Book Historians Podcast with Alex Grant and Jim Thompson. Today, we're interviewing comic book historian Ken Quattro, who recently published a critically acclaimed and beloved book, Invisible Men, about the trailblazing Black comic artists of the early 20th century. There's been very little historical research into this area of comic history. We'll go more into that later. But Ken sets up a historical atmosphere of what occurred between Reconstruction and World War II, the rise of the KKK, in the midst of the context of the formation of the NAACP, the Harlem Renaissance, the overall everyday life of the Black experience, being refused to buy a house because a person's Blackness was discovered, all in the midst of contributing to the comic world. Ken, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure being here, guys.
So what we're going to do is hopscotch through your life and your research into this book. Jim's going to start on your early years. Go ahead, Jim.
You were born in Detroit.
1952.
Which means that your first comic book, which was Flash number 121, if I'm correct.
Wow, you're good. Yeah, that's right.
Was actually you were 10 or so. I was thinking you were about 8, but you were around 10.
Well, if it was actually I was 8 years old because my birthday's in December. So in early 1961 when it came out, I was 8 years old.
Okay,
but actually, I'd read comics before that. My brother was a big comic book fan, and the only comic books he kept from, he's quite a bit older, and the only comic books he kept were classic comics. So I grew up on classic comics even before I read any comics of my own.
Your older brother, if I'm correct, is the one that took you a few months later where you bought Secret Origins comic.
That's right. That was the thing that sold me on comic books. I mean, when I read all those Origins and that was it. I just fell in love with comic books.
So tell us the story about what you thought Flash 121 was about when you bought it.
It's kind of bizarre, but the night before, on Sunday night, it was Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color, and they have one of those wildlife adventure things Disney used to make, and it was called Flash the Teenage Otter. Well, when I was in the drugstore the next morning with my parents, they were picking up a prescription for me. I saw a Flash comic book, and my first reaction was, "Oh, this is about the teenage otter." Well, when I I looked at the cover, obviously it wasn't in that, and I took it home, and like I said, I was hooked almost immediately with comics.
I was going to ask you if you thought Flash and Trickster were chasing the otter, or the otter.
I don't know. It was bizarre. It was a bizarre entry into comics, but I'll never forget it. I mean, it made a huge impact on me.
And it's the otter. That's compelling stuff, I would say, back in those days.
Oh, I love the Walt Disney stuff in that. I used to love those. I think called Wildlife Adventures. They used to make. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, those
good stuff.
I remember those as well. All right, so that got you interested, and I've heard you talk about the Secret Origins issue, why that was the sort of road to Damascus for you. That was the one that got you really interested, and
right.
It was because of the history, which was part of you from the very beginning.
Right. It's I've always been into history and stuff like that. Ironically, I was into mythology even before I was into comic books. I started reading really young. I was reading novels when I was 4 years old. And my mom used to tease me about it, how I was always into all these mythological super type characters. And that preceded even comic books. And the comic books to me were almost like a modern day version of the mythological gods. So one built upon the other.
Were you a Ray Harryhausen fan and all that?
To a certain extent, Ned. I loved all the science fiction movies and stuff like that. I mean, I just ate all that stuff up.
Yeah,
everything like that.
As a kid in the early 80s, I loved that Clash of the Titans, and I think I liked mythology more before comics also. That's interesting you say that.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a definite connection, between the two. And to me, it was like one built upon the other. And then, the whole historical aspect of it really came into focus for me with Jerry Bales.
Yep. That's going to go next, which is...
Oh, go ahead.
Early on became aware...
And Jim, before you ask that, can you increase your microphone input by like 10%?
Okay.
I just want to make the audio easier to edit later. That's all. And then I'll splice my little interjection out.
How's that?
It's better. Thank you.
You want more?
Maybe 5% more.
Okay, how's that?
Much better. Thank you so much.
Okay. So Ken, yeah, I wanted to talk about Jerry Bales because you became aware of him and letters pages and alter ego and all of that really early on. What, you're about 12 or so at that point?
Yeah, maybe a little younger, because he was writing letters to like the Julie Schwartz comics, you know, the Flash and comics like that, Justice League of America. And, you know, I would see his name and I'd see Detroit, Michigan next to it. Well, that's where I was at, or just in the suburbs of Detroit. And, you know, to me, that was really cool that there was an adult out there that actually liked comic books. And he was talking about these previous versions of the characters that appeared, you know, to me, sometime in the distant past. It was only like 15 years before, but you know, the 1940s, early 50s seemed like ancient history to me. And then I ran into them eventually at these early conventions, which were, they were held in hotel rooms. I mean, literally you would walk into this small room and just see a bunch of tables with piles and piles of old comic books on it. Nothing was bagged, nothing was boarded. It was just piles of all these old comics. And it was mostly adults who were selling them. It was kind of neat. And Bales was one of the guys. Most of my early comics I bought from him.
So had you met him before the 1967 Detroit Con? That was the first one?
No. It was that was the first time I met him. And like I said, I was such a shy kid, man. I could hardly talk to him. I think the first comic I bought from him was Detective 30. I bought a copy from him. Which was cool.
And just to clarify with the audience, this is the Detroit Triple Fanfare. And it was 1967 or 68?
68, I believe, was the first one, because I think they skipped one year. It was the third one. I know that.
Yeah, okay. It's the third one. Oh, because they skipped a year. That's why it's not.
Yeah. Because I even get confused on that sometimes.
But the first one was in 64. Now, were you aware of it at the time? Because you were
no, like I said, only through the letters columns and stuff like that. When he would talk about, he set up this organization. I think it was the American Comic Book Association or something. And he mentioned, giving away the Alley Awards, which is named after Alley Oop. And, I would see references to it and stuff like that. Well, eventually I started, after those early conventions, I started buying his publications. And Bales was the first one really to start indexing and everything, comics. He started detailing what was in each comic book. And a lot of times he would write these little explanations about, who the character was. And sometimes he would write about, the artists and things like that. And that's when it first hit me. There was something more going on. There's somebody, actually a physical person, creating these comic books, and that there was a world behind the comic book.
So you were reading what, like what is it, Panelologist?
The Panelologist.
Yeah.
She told me, I've ever brought some copies up here and shown you and that, but I got all the issues of it.
Oh, I would have loved to see that. Show it to me at some other time.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. But it's
Hey, those, Alex.
I have not seen that.
Oh, tell us about that for a second.
Yeah, they were just hand stapled things that he typed up and printed off probably on a mimeograph machine.
Oh, I have seen that because I like the early fanzine stuff. Yes.
Yeah. But like I said, he was the first one really to start detailing this and to put comic books really into a historical form. Like, to a lot of people, comics history is just talking about a character. Bales, to me, was the first one to start talking about the people behind the comics. And it wasn't just him. Obviously, you had guys like Hainsware and, there's other guys doing the same work, John Benson, stuff like that. But I became aware of it through Bales. And like I said, I started doing my own research almost immediately. And I was still a kid. I was probably like 18, 19 years old.
Oh, that's
so it's
cool.
been about 50 years.
Is it an overstatement to say that Jerry Bales is seen as a godfather to early comic book fandom? Is that correct?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, like a lot of, if you want to be really technical, there was actually comic book fandom going back to the 40s, probably.
Right. And then the science fiction fandom back to the 30s even, right? Or earlier.
Right. And there was a EC fandom with guys like John Benston and stuff like that, that was pretty active back in the 50s. Mm-hmm. But as far as like
superhero,
and Bales happened to come along just as the Silver Age was starting. And to me, the Silver Age, despite what anybody thinks, started with Marvel, okay? Even though they like to say it's 1956, to me, that was a transitionary period, because it wasn't an immediate going from the Golden Age to the Silver Age. It wasn't like somebody flipped a switch. There was a transitionary period in there where, comic books went through the whole, code thing. And, there's a lot of companies closed down and, people left the business. So a lot of companies were going through transition at the time. But it wasn't until like the introduction of Justice League of America in 1960. And then what came right after that in 61 was Fantastic Four. And to me, that's really when the Silver Age started.
Wow.
And that's
Case 4.
What's that?
Showcase 4.
No. I mean, that's retroactive history that people are applying there. It's not true. And even Bale said that. And I mean, I quoted him. I got a whole long thing I've written called The New Ages. And actually, Jerry helped me write it back in a couple of years before he died, where people like to think that just because, they updated the Flash, automatically everything changed at that point. It didn't. Nothing really changed. I mean,
it all kind of trickled in.
Right. I mean, DC didn't even start getting the sales figures back until after Showcase number 8. Okay. And even then, it just sort of indicated to them that there may be a market for superheroes, but it wasn't like everybody started doing superheroes in 1956. They didn't.
Right.
I mean, the best-selling comics at that time by far were Dell Comics. It wasn't even close. And it continued that way right up until about 1960. And it wasn't until, Marvel came along in 61. And then, right after Fantastic Four, you had the Hulk, and then you had Spider-Man. And that just set everything off. And that's where you see the real beginnings of the Silver Age happening. And Bales had a lot to do with that because he got a lot of people interested in the history of comics in tying the old with the new and showing that there was, a history to it.
Within the context of these superhero team books that were just coming out.
Right. See, there's such a focus on superheroes and fandom. It distorts the reality of what physically happened on the ground. Mm-hmm. And any old time fan will tell you that if you talk to Maggie Thompson or any of these old timers and stuff, they'll tell you flat out, Dell Comics were by far the biggest selling comics, of the late 50s.
Well, all that like Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse stuff, right?
Without a doubt. It wasn't, superhero comics. There was only a handful, being published at the time. And a couple, a lot of companies that tried them, like Archie Comics, they tried bringing back, what's his name? God, I can't think of his name. Got the flag. What's his name?
Oh, the Shield? You mean?
The Shield, yeah. They tried bringing back the Shield.
Yeah, you're talking about like the Mighty Comics group of like 66, 67?
Right, but, they proceeded, back in 59, Simon and Kirby, brought back the Shield.
Oh, yeah, that guy, yes.
Yeah,
that guy. Private Strong, right?
It's Private Strong, that's what I was trying to think of. Yeah, they brought it back for a couple issues. It was basically a flop. There was the Fly and the Jaguar, which are, minor things, but their biggest selling characters were Archie.
Yeah, Jack
So it wasn't until Marvel really came along in 61 that, set everything off.
Yeah, true. I mean, that was a movement. And the JLA, obviously, yes. That means it's like,
the JLA was the one that showed that teams would work and stuff that.
Yeah, Team
Superhero.
That's,
the apocryphal story of it led to Stan Lee talking to Martin Goodman and all that stuff.
Yeah. That's where the chasing of the genre started, right?
Exactly. Right. And again, comic historians have a very myopic view because of superheroes. It's distorted everything, but comic books follow trends.
Right.
They don't, they're not dedicated to a particular genre. They just go with what sells. Just like after World War II, when the superheroes started dying out, is when all these crime comics came along.
Yes.
Science fiction and westerns.
Even the ages of comic books, it's actually very superhero focused.
Right. Again, I wrote this thing called The New Ages with Jerry Bales. And, and what we did is we broke it down into different ages. That's why I call it The New Ages, in a different way of looking at it.
So this is where academia and scholarship comes in, because in film studies and genre, there have been people like Rick Altman that have written about the functions of genre. And so definitions of genre are different depending upon what its function is. And I think that that's the same thing with the notions of these ages, which are cycles and such. They have different functions for different players. So I agree with you in the context of how you're using it. But if you're talking about superheroes, well, obviously, the Earth 2 heroes are the beginning of the Silver Age, or Earth 1, Earth 1. So the Silver Age Flash has to be Silver Age. So from that point, it would be that beginning, or Martian Manhunter, or whatever. But that's not what dealers and collectors would use. It would be a different function. The functions are like audience, contract, producers, blueprint, things like that, contract, formula, blueprint, and such. And so if you add that to it, it becomes more nuanced, and we're speaking about it where there's multiple functions for these things like ages.
Well, see, you're absolutely right there, Jim. And see, a lot of the ages, and this is something like, you guys all know Bob Bierbaum, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Of course.
No, I know what I'm saying, but this is where him and I totally agree on, is that a lot of the creation of the supposed ages, was a dealer created. Okay, the Silver Age, the definition of Golden Age and stuff came out like in the 60s there.
Yes,
and Silver Age was just sort of like a natural follow up to it. Okay,
yes,
but after that, any other terms that they use, like, Copper Age or Bronze Age and stuff like that, it's nonsensical. It makes no sense at all.
I think sticking to the metals and keep adding more, I think that gets a little silly.
Well, it is silly, and to me, it diminutizes the history of comics. See, to me, as comic fans and historians, we've hurt our own cause by treating it the way we do, by being such big fans. There's a problem, at the same time, comic history has been written mostly by fans. It also has sort of held it back, because we seem to remove comic books from just the whole scheme of society by doing that, by being so myopic about it. Because comic books, to me, have always reacted to outside influences. And to me, that's the way I define the different ages, is by the outside influences that created these trends that happen in comics. It's, again, if you go back to like the 1950s is a good example. All the anti-communist comic books, especially that they had at the time, they were reacting to the bigger scheme of what was happening throughout the country. It wasn't, a genre created in comic books, anti-communist comic books. Right. They were just reacting to what was happening in the outside world.
How do you feel about the term atomic age?
Well, I hate that. I mean, even Bob says that, and he's the one who came up with it. He did it almost as an offhanded kind of thing for Overstreet. He sort of created that term. But atomic age is ridiculous. Why not call it television age? I mean, television had a greater effect upon comics than the atomic bomb. If you think about, because they were responding mostly to what was happening on television.
Yeah, that's a good point.
If you look at a lot of comic books that were created in the 50s, there were so many knockoffs of like Isle of Lucy and all these other shows that were happening at the time, and they were just translating it to comics. Comics,
right? That's a better way to describe it. You're right.
Right. Comic books are a responsive medium. They rarely led, in trends in society. They usually follow. And the whole superhero thing was basically just an outgrowth of what was happening in the pulps, if you look at it. I mean, they just took basically pulp characters and juiced them up a little bit, and they put them in comics. I mean, it's a lot of the same guys creating the same characters.
This is cool. Yeah, because, now I think from 98 and on, we're kind of stuck in almost like a movie age where it's all chasing movies. But that's cool that the early 50s chased TV. That's awesome.
Yeah, but Alex, the movies are chasing they're
chasing each other. Yeah, it's stuck in that though.
Yeah, well, I think that movies are using comics. I think it's a.
But a lot of people are making comics in hopes to get a movie made out of it.
Exactly right. See what's happening in comics now, and this is the thing. I had Scott McCloud was a visiting professor at a university near here about 10 years back. And I was invited to come to a little forum that he had. Me and him kind of got into it a little bit. And I tried saying that comic books, what's happening now is what I call boutique comics, in the sense of like, they're not looking at a large audience. They're looking at a very specific audience. And it's no longer become like they're trying to appeal to a mass audience. They're trying to appeal to a specific audience. And to do that, they're very personalized comic books, at least to me, of the ones that I've read. And obviously not all of them are like that, but they have a very specific reason. Where at one time, comic books were, again, they're trying to sell millions of copies. Now, what do they sell? 20,000 copies, 30,000 copies? In a country of 350 million people, that's literally nothing.
Right. It's almost like more like subculture comics now.
Right. And that's the mode we're in right now. But the movie industry, and Jim would know this a lot better than I would, is, they're just utilizing comics as a launching point,
content.
Right. As content. But again, they'll probably tire of that at some point. At some point, the genre will wear itself down, just like Westerns or anybody else. There'll always be, I believe, like a superhero type movies, but I can't see it lasting as, these great blockbusters year in and year out.
Right.
Just because people change, society changes.
I always make the comparison to the Western, and it's broken into television. We will hit a saturation with the superheroes.
Right.
Hit a saturation point at some point, but also the evolution of the genre and the cycle is such that they're becoming more sophisticated. We will get some interesting films before it fades. And
exactly. I totally agree with you. 100%.
Well, I hope, but I think the difference though is that Westerns don't have a correlation with the growth of technology, and superhero films do, and technology is constantly growing, and that's going to cause it to last longer than the Westerns did. And my only worry is, like, what if that changes that cycle? I mean, I guess time will tell, but I don't know.
I respect that, but I disagree completely, and I'll tell you why. CinemaScope, the widescreen that allowed for something like Wild Bunch and things, technology was changing in terms of sound, in terms of the film aspect and everything. You look at Stagecoach, and then you look at a film from the late 1950s and some of Ford's later stuff, or Hawk's later stuff, or certainly by the time you get to Peckinpah, technology has changed completely.
I mean, the rate of change, you're right, is important, but we're a far more technologically obsessed society than ever. And I think that might make a psychological difference or impact as far as audience fatigue to what they're, and some sorts of desensitization that we're getting from these movies. I don't know.
Right. Well, I think it's starting to happen right now personally, because, they can't keep cranking out these films. Like Wonder Woman is, to me, the latest example. I just saw, about a week or so ago. And I don't know if you guys saw that new Wonder Woman film, but I was disappointed. Okay.
Right.
There's just not much there. If there's a little bit of action, a couple action scenes are kind of cool, especially at the beginning, but there's not much there to the story. And to me, that's if they make too many films like that, that'll be the death knell to the to the comic book trend.
But
because
that could be theoretically clumped into movies like Green Lantern and whatever, that just more often than not there's a misfire in DC movies. It could just be clumped into that pattern.
Well, it could be, but what I'm getting to, Alex, is that I think people eventually just tire of the
genre.
Of the genre, and just, there's so much eye candy that you can provide to hold people's attention. They want a story. I mean, I think maybe it's because I write. To me, a story is very important in anything you write.
Right.
Whether it's a comic book, a novel, or a movie, or anything. To me, the story is important.
Yeah.
To hold my attention. There's so many movies made where at the end of the film, I'm going like, really? That's it? It just sort of meanders off into nothing. And I think that's the danger a lot of times with comic books, that there's a lot of flash, but there's not a lot of story behind it.
I think the thing is, and this is unique probably to everything except maybe MGM musicals versus other musicals in the classic era, in that there is a clear division. There's DC and there's Marvel, and Marvel hasn't made that misstep. So none of their films have failed the way that DC films are.
I agree with you on that.
Whatever. And now that they're making a serious move into television, I'm not sure how long it's going to go, but like WandaVision is getting tremendous buzz.
Have you guys seen that yet?
No.
You seen
No, it's coming out in 5 days.
Yeah.
I thought maybe you saw clips or something of it. I don't know.
Well, there's definitely commercials, but yeah, the interesting thing, I think also, I also read, I think it's Kevin Feige. I think it's all about him. I think it's I think he may actually start getting involved into some Star Wars content as well. And I think they're all like thinking him and Favreau are the key to the streaming golden ticket, is what I'm thinking. But we really should talk about Ken's book, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right, so Jim, but Jim, continue.
Okay, so I want to get a sense. Go back in time now. We left you as a kid, basically, in 1968, and you're still reading, and you're reading comics. Do you ever stop going and buying comics on a regular basis?
No. From 1967, to give you an idea, 1967, I got my first job. Okay. Actually, in May of 1967, the month that Sgt. Pepper came out, just to give you an idea how old
That's
I am.
awesome.
Yeah. But anyways, I got my first job. And from that point until 1975, when I first got married, I literally bought every comic book that was on the stand.
Oh, cool.
Okay. I would go into a local bookstore, and they had a comic rack, and I would take one of every single comic book that came out, and 2 copies of every #1 issue that came out. And like I said, that's all I ever wanted to do was draw comics and everything.
Every Monday, I would have my dad drive me to 7-Eleven, and there would be the wired package of comic newspaper over them, and I would wait until the comic the 7-Eleven guy cut it, and he would let me go through it and get them before they even went on the rack.
Oh yeah, it was key to get the ones that were a couple issues down, though, because the ones on top always have the wire cuts in them and stuff. Yeah,
and so I don't think from 67 to now I don't have in the next room a comic with a month and a year. I mean, I never stopped.
Right.
Did you ever hit a point where you said, okay, I just can't go? Because a lot of people do. They have that, that Barry Pearl notion of, okay, I quit this month and I've never read a comic.
Yeah, he stopped in like 79 or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, no. What I did was briefly when I first got married, and that I stopped reading for a very short period of time. I mean, like a month or 2 maybe. But from there right up through the 90s, I was probably bought comic books every single month. I mean, I had a complete collection of Marvel comics from Fantastic Four #1 on, right through the 70s up to through the 80s until probably about 10 years ago when I started selling some of it off. But I've had a lot of comics.
Your love back then, you were more of a Marvel guy?
No, I just love comic books. I mean, Marvel was the one that really hooked me. I'm gonna say that in the beginning. To me, like matter of fact, I was on a podcast yesterday, and the guy said, if you were stuck on a desert island, what comic or series would you like to, have just the rest of your life? And I said, Spider-Man 1 through 38.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that was the perfect comic book. And especially when you get down to the that famous sequence, in Spider-Man number 33, where he's lifting the heavy machinery off and stuff like that. Yeah. To me, that the 5-page sequence, in that right there was all you need to know about comic books right there. Why I love comic books, and it tells everything you need to know about how to build a story and everything in a comic. It was amazing. And what was so great about it to me was the hero of that story wasn't Spider-Man. It was Peter Parker. Yeah. Because Peter Parker that's what made him lift that. It wasn't this idea of being a superhero. It was the idea he was saving his Aunt May because he had to get this serum to her to save her life. And that's what gave him the strength to lift this thing off of him. And that's what made him heroic. And it wasn't this godlike superiority that Superman has and stuff like that, where he's saving the entire world. It was just that one single person, trying to save somebody in his family. I just think that's an amazing sequence.
It is.
Now that in Daredevil.
And the number of boxes, I mean, they would decrease with each page until there was a big...
Right. Like I said, it's a 5-page sequence, I think, leading up there from the beginning, from the splash panel to where he lifts that one...
There's a cool usage of the panels and the countdown, and then this...
Brilliant. Explosive. It was just so brilliant.
Yeah, that's true.
That one and Namor dragging Daredevil and on the ground and he's...
Oh, there's a lot of great scenes. I mean...
Yeah, no, but I mean, for me, that may be why I became a lawyer. Is Daredevil.
Matt Murdock, man, you heard it right here, folks. The origin of Matt Murdock.
Somewhere in those trunks in the courtroom, and not because I wanted to see that necessarily, but
that's what got me. That's why because of Namor himself, not Daredevil, but yeah.
Is it that? But that's funny. But yeah, there's a Kirby, a Wood, and a Ditko for me that all swim around there and formed my basic moral system.
Right. And, that's like 1965. All that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. But see, I started in it would be like 67, 68, but everything was being reprinted in the reprint books at the same time. So while I might not have gotten it in the same version as Ken did, I was reading those books at the same time because they were coming out in Marvel Greatest Comics or Fantasy Masterpiece.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So let's get you to college. It's time for you to go to college.
Okay.
You're still reading comics and did you decide you wanted to be a journalist? Because I know you were a journalism major, and tell me where you went to school.
Okay. It's kind of complicated for me. Early on, I knew I wanted to draw comic books. And again, it was probably Steve Ditko who made me want to do that. I don't know if you guys saw yesterday, I posted the cover of, I drew a copy of Spider-Man number 38. I copied it back when I was 13 years old. I put it up on my Facebook page yesterday. I just happened to find it. But anyways, I always wanted to be a comic book artist. Well, my mom really encouraged me and all that stuff like that, to be an artist and everything. Well, she died of lung cancer when I was in 10th grade. And that kind of just changed everything for me at the time. And my family ran restaurants. My father was one of the founders of Little Caesars. I don't know if you guys, know the pizza place, right? Yeah. Okay. So we have a bunch of restaurants. And I was working in our restaurant and stuff like that. And it was just assumed that I was going to be an heir to working these restaurants for the rest of my life. So I kind of had to swim against the stream there to go to college and study artwork and stuff. And even though I wanted to study artwork, I was discouraged by my counselors in school of taking up arts. Don't ask me why. But they said there's no real career in it or anything, even though, that's all I ever wanted to do. So I went to my second level, which was writing. And I majored in things like, I majored in journalism. I went to Eastern Michigan University, and I also went to University of Michigan. I bounced back and forth between the two. And I took these journalism classes with all these professors who were amazing writers, guys who had been war correspondents in World War II and everything, and had these fantastic stories and everything. And they kind of ingrained in me this objective perspective of viewing a story. And I talked a little bit about this off the air with Alex, and that's, it's become part of my personality to try to be as objective as I can to when I look at anything. Even though I may have my own personal biases, I try not to let that come through in the things that I write about. And that's where I became, even though I studied journalism, again, I never really made a career of it in that, because it didn't really pay that much. I had, like I said, I got divorced early when I was only 24. We had a son, and I ended up raising him by myself for 12 years. So what I did for 12 years is, well, more than 12 years, is I worked for FedEx. And I was a delivery guy for FedEx for 27 years. And I did all this other stuff on the side. I went back to college. I got a degree in computer programming. I became a fine arts major after that. And I studied fine art at Eastern Michigan.
This is fascinating to me because well, let me just say I was a journalism major too, and I wanted to be an artist, all the same things up until I didn't get married. I went to law school, and that's
right.
But apart from that, it's almost the exact same. But this is why you and I actually get along, even though we might otherwise not, based upon other things.
Oh, I'm an easygoing guy, Jim, believe me.
Me too, as Alex will say. But you know what I mean. When you and I talk, we never have issues when we're running back and forth.
No.
Even though we may have different ideologies in a lot of ways or different thoughts about things. Listening to you and Alex talking earlier, hear me go, no, but I was doing it in terms of content. But we never.
And that's what happens when you don't click join audio on the screen.
That'll teach you.
So I just want to say this makes sense to me because it's that journalistic sensibility of dealing with the facts and getting it
right,
the details out there rather than trying to turn it into a point of view is a thing that I think we respect each other for.
Right. Like I said, and that was really important to me in writing this book. Because one, not only was I referencing mostly news articles, I didn't want to make the book a diatribe or a narrative that I was trying to sell to anybody. I just wanted to report the facts about these men in, the world surrounding them, what they had to deal with. I mean, these are actual facts. This is not me mythologizing anything, and it wasn't me working from apocryphal stories like a lot of comic book stories are. That drives me crazy. That's one of the things that drives me crazy most about a lot of comics history, is it's based upon just stories people pass down, and you got to be careful of that. It's always nice to have accounts from people who were during that time period, but everybody has their own perspective. In involving, like, Matt Baker is a perfect example. There's always been this rumor that Matt Baker was gay, for instance. You get some people who said that he was gay, yet other people, including his family, swear that he wasn't. Okay. So I was presented with two sets of facts there, two opposing ideas. So what I did in the book is present both of them. And I just leave it to the reader, saying, I ended with just, he never came out, one way or another. So I can't sit there and make a statement about what he was or wasn't. And it's not fair of me, I didn't think, as a historian or a journalist, to make that determination. I'd much prefer that you just present the facts to people and let them determine for themselves.
Yeah, I've read pretty much every book on Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster and the creation of things. And every single person is, even the best of the books, they always make a decision about some of the things that have different stories and mythologies about them. And they present it as fact. And it's
Right.
not fact. There are several where it's like, well, that's either true or it's not true, but nobody knows for sure. And they always say, this is what happened. And it drives me crazy. And not a single one has not done what you did, which is to say, some say this, some say that.
Right. And like I say, it's, I just try to be fair with everybody, and I just want to be honest. It's, to me, that's the way history has to be presented or should be presented. And like I say, I'm privy to a lot of information that I never share with people. And that's because people trust me when they tell me certain things. Hi there. And, I've seen documentation. I've seen contracts sometimes that would stun people if they knew they existed. But I've been sworn to secrecy not to, discuss those sort of things. But that's just part of the thing about being a journalist. You're presented with facts, and sometimes you have to winnow out what you can report and what you can't report. And I always try to fall on the side of, if it's going to hurt somebody, I'm not going to do it. And especially like with Baker's family, his half-brother's still alive and stuff like that. It wouldn't be fair to me to make a judgment.
Right.
One
and
way or
the
another.
two competing narratives about that are from his half-brother that's saying he
Right.
wasn't, and then from Baker's best friend, Frank Giusti, who is
Right.
a comic artist also, who's saying he was, right? Those are the two competing narratives.
I believe so. And there was, who else was it? It was Osrin. He said he was not, and he was his inker.
Yeah, he was his
he
inker,
knew him
yeah.
for years. So
Right.
again, you have these competing perspectives. And, it's only fair to present both sides. That's what
Right.
you have to do. At least I think, should be a journalist's job.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a great segue point to get to actually talking about your book. And,
Okay.
and specifically, Alex is going to ask you about the spark that started this.
Yeah. So, first I want to compliment you on it because I read it, I loved it, and I noticed that you put warts and all on every aspect of it. You write both about even the pros and cons of some things, like Woodrow Wilson's involvement with the KKK, and that he was a Democrat with the Southern Democrat Jim Crow laws, but also then with the Harlem Renaissance, how there's also a good side to the Democrat involvement when some of these Black artists were part of liberal movements to improve their rights in the world. So it's interesting. You have both. You really address it from a lot of angles, and I want to compliment you. But tell us first, how did the book start? Tell us about the initial spark. What started all this?
Well, again, it goes back to Matt Baker. Years ago, about 20 years ago, like I told you before, he was always one of my favorite artists. And I just really, liked him. And I was actually, at the time, I was doing research for a long article on St. John Comics. And he was their main artist for the romance line.
Right. Archer
and I
St.
wanted
John.
to get, right, and I wanted to do some background information on him. Well, at the time, 20 years ago, there was almost nothing known about him. There was two facts that everybody knew: that he died young and that he was Black. Well, I kept asking around everybody I would come across, what do you know about Matt Baker? Do you know anybody who knew Matt Baker? And nobody did, at least not that I'd come across, until finally somebody said to me, and I can't remember who it was, have you ever talked to Samuel Joyner, who was a retired Black cartoonist in Philadelphia? They said he'd been around for a long time and he knew a lot of other Black artists. So I got his address and I wrote to him. And Mr. Joyner wrote me back a letter, a 4-page letter, and a whole packet of clippings and photocopies of not only stuff about Matt Baker, but Jay Jackson and, Elmer Stoner, who I knew, and stuff like that, but several other artists, Ted Shearer. And he just said, different cartoonists that he knew, not just comic book artists, but different artists. And he also mentioned that he was friends with Cal Massey. Him and Cal Massey had gone to New York. They were from Philadelphia, and they'd gone to New York together in 1950 to visit all these Black artists. And they met E. Sims Campbell, and they met, Matt Baker and Elmer Stoner and Ted Shearer. And they went around to all their studios and got tips from all these guys. Well, after I got this letter, I wrote to Mr. Stoner again, and he wrote me back more about his personal background.
Oh, yeah? That's cool.
As a cartoonist. Matter of fact, I just put something about that on my blog about a week or so ago, a couple of weeks ago, about him. Fascinating, wonderful man, wonderful, wonderful man. And he's really the one who deserves all the credit for this book existing, because he's the one who gave me the spark, the idea for it. And so I started looking into some of, not a Matt Baker, but other artists that he mentioned. And I did what I normally do, which is start looking in newspaper archives and stuff like that to see if I could find any information. And there was nothing in the regular newspaper archives about these guys. And I go like, that's so weird. And it dawned on me to try to find a Black newspaper archive, which at the time was very hard because, unfortunately, most libraries never kept copies of Black newspapers. They just never did, But on ProQuest,
and that's kind of weird, I think.
It's very weird. I mean, there's very, very few archival sources for Black newspapers in this country. There's more now than there was when I started this, it was 20 years ago. At that time, there was hardly anything. But finally, over time, I would find, one here, or I'd find a partial one in another place. And then I would start finding articles about these guys. And many of these guys were well-respected fine artists, or they were cartoonists in the Black media. I mean, the newspapers of the Black newspapers of the 40s are full of stuff by Robert Pius, Elton Fax, all these guys, E. Harper Johnson, J.J. It's all these guys were regular artists, well-known artists in the Black media, but totally unknown in the white media. And I speak about dual consciousness. There was a book written by W.E.B. Du Bois back in 1903, I think it was, called The Soul of Black Folks. Okay, and he speaks about dual consciousness, where basically it's where Black people learn to lead two different lives. The lives they lead at home and in Black society, with the other Black people, and the lives they lead in white society. And it's literally two different worlds. And as a white person, even though I may have had some inkling of that, I never realized it until I started reading all this Black media.
Right.
And you talk about an eye-opening experience. I wish, they had classes in schools where all you did was just read Black media from the mid-1950s and going back. You would get such a different perspective of the world, of America.
That's cool.
Than what you see in white media. It's amazing. The same stories would be covered, but in totally different perspective. Or you would see in white media where something was not covered at all, like say a lynching. There was some 1,500 lynchings prior to 1950 in America, from like 1910 to 1950 or something like that. 1,500.
Wow.
But rarely were they covered in the white media, or if they were, many times they're on the back pages. In Black media, it'd be front page news and headlines and pictures and stuff. And like I said, it's like all of a sudden stepping into a different world, and that's what again, with this book, I tried to do is I try to share that experience with people, with white and Black people, because even a lot of younger Black people, I don't think are aware of everything that their forefathers went through. I mean, it was unbelievable, the discrimination, the Jim Crow laws and stuff that they went through on a daily basis that we can't even comprehend.
Right.
And that's what I just try to, again, I just try to show that to people and say, like, these guys didn't just draw comic books. Comic books were the entry point into their lives for me. But there's so much more going on. And that's,
Yeah.
again,
and you do that really well, because you create an atmosphere of the Harlem Renaissance and the involvement of that. And then also even other things that other people wouldn't really think about or talk about, like the difference between the African-American experience in comparison to the African Caribbean experience in America.
Right.
And it's like two totally different experiences, two totally different sets of even self-esteem back then, and outcomes.
Right.
It's really interesting.
Right.
All right. So Jim,
Yeah,
go
go
ahead
ahead.
into his research aspect of it.
You're talking about it. I mean, you've explained it pretty much, that you're a primary source researcher.
Right.
And in fact, you've called yourself more of a detective than a historian.
Exactly.
Why do you not call yourself a research journalist instead of detective? Is it just because of?
Well, okay. Partially it's tongue in cheek, because I don't know if you realize that comics detective, flip it around, as Detective Comics. Okay.
That's what I was.
Okay. That's part of the reason.
But we won't tell the DC lawyers that. Right.
Like one time I made a logo up where I just flipped the logo around, Detective Comics, and put comics, but I said that's a little much. But that's part of the reason. But also, as far as like the historian part of it, I don't think I really have the bona fides to call myself that. I didn't go to college for it. I don't have a degree in it. And I think that a lot of times a historian is basically a person who interprets history. And that's not something I really try to do. I just try to report history. And that's the way I look at it. I mean, it's, and as far as like being a detective, that's basically what I do, is I just try to find information and try to find connecting threads. I'm really good at finding connective threads between stories and people and stuff like that. I've gone down rabbit holes you wouldn't believe sometimes, to find something.
Well, I was listening to a lecture that you gave, and you were talking about going into the FBI files for
Right.
for example, and which.
Right.
Wait, for who? Did you say it again, Jim?
Oh, for Lev Gleason.
Yeah.
Right.
The only one, because the guy that wrote the book currently, his great nephew, did this thing.
Brett Dakin.
But
Yes.
that's family, and I think that's a wonderful book too. I really enjoyed reading. That's the kind of researcher that I want. I mean, because that's fascinating to me, and it seems like that's your approach to all of that. The question I would have is, when this started, some of these people were alive. Did you go and talk to family members? Did you try to talk to the artist? Because
no, well, the only artist who were still alive at that time that I knew was Cal Massey, really, and I really didn't know how to get a hold of him or anything else. And Matt Baker's family, had already done a long interview with All-Negro magazine, and Jim Amish, who's a friend of mine and stuff like that. And just
is that how his last name is? Is that how his last name is?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know. I thought it was Amash for some reason. Okay.
Well, that's because you're thinking about the guy from Michigan who was in Congress.
Oh, okay. That's probably right. Yeah.
But
okay.
He's actually a relative of his, I believe.
Yeah.
But that's a cousin, I think. But that's another story. Anyways, but he was a friend of mine, and that, out of respect for him and that, I didn't want to retrod the same path that he had, interviewing something right after he interviewed somebody. And a lot of times too, to be honest, I try to keep an arm's length away from family members a lot of times, because you never know how they're going to react. Even though I've interviewed a lot of family members, I've had totally different results. Some people, like Bernard Baily's family, couldn't have been nicer. And I have a huge amount of personal information that they shared with me about Bernard Baily. But I've had other families who have been, they're very sensitive about being contacted, because a lot of times they're ashamed that they worked in comic books. which I know is hard to believe, but even Baily's family, his wife and stuff, while she was alive, they were ashamed that he worked in comic books, and they never wanted to talk about it. And the only reason why his kids talked to me is because their parents had already passed on. But so it's kind of a double-edged sword when you're talking to family members.
Right.
And
I heard that the Mac Rabois family had similar weird concerns about talking about him that much.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of a, like I say, it's a double-edged thing. So you never know what you're going to get yourself into when you contact somebody. And I didn't want somebody to short circuit what I started on. And to tell an objective story, equally throughout each one of these guys, I thought it was only fair to do it the same throughout all. I didn't want to give more credence to one story than I would to somebody else, just because I've had more access, maybe.
Yeah.
Like I say, I'd be interested to talk to some of these family members, but again, I'll kind of leave that up to them.
I've also read where you've talked about the nature of comic book history and historians, where it's largely fan based, rather than from independent academic scholarship.
Right.
And scholarship, and that makes a difference because there's a biased love for it. And once you start, if you're doing a Kirby biography and you used to spend your teen years at Kirby's house, you're going to have a certain perspective.
Exactly.
And you escape that trap that a lot of similar historians who have a large fan background in it don't escape that. And so I think you were very smart to do that. And that's why I asked you that question.
Well, again, Jim, that goes back to the whole journalistic thing, though. I learned that early on to try to create that distance between me and the story, no matter how I feel about it. I am a comic fan, obviously, a huge comic fan. But to me, that's just the starting point of what interests me. But if you get somebody writing about these, what I've always thought was interesting, if you get somebody who's writing from like an academic point of view, like say Jill Lepore did with The Secret History of Wonder Woman. Yeah. Okay. You get a totally different view. She wasn't a comic fan coming in, to write this thing of Wonder Woman. And that's why there's such a difference of opinion of that book. I mean, some people love that book and some people hate that book, but it's because she came in as a person who has no personal attachment to comic books. And I think that kind of skews, in a way, the story, because she has that academic distance there. You see what I'm saying? I mean, I think I'm lucky in a sense of that I do have the fondness for comics, and I do understand what comic fans like about these artists and stuff like that. Like say Matt Baker. I mean, I could write a book on Matt Baker and the things I love about his artwork, no problem. But that wasn't what I was trying to portray. But at the same time, that was the entry point into his life for me, was comic books.
Non-comic fan scholars who come in and want to do it because it's the hot topic make more errors in their.
Oh, it drives me crazy. It drives me crazy.
Errors sometimes. And have lay people civilians will come up to me and say, "Did you read the Lepore book? Isn't it great? You must love it." And say, "Well, it's hard to get past all of the stuff that's just tragically wrong about it."
Right. But she did some really good work in it too. You see, and that's, maybe I'm a little biased because she also consulted me and I'm quoted in the book. But she did some really good work, and I think she was, she's a good writer as far as like that's concerned. But like you say, there's mistakes in it, and that's what the problem I have with anything I read about comics history. Once I start reading it, even you guys seen me do this on your own site there, where somebody will say something, and it's like something explodes in my head, like, oh my God, don't say that, or you're so wrong.
Oh, I remember some of the explosions. Yes.
Oh yeah. As I said, I got to watch that. I'm Italian. It's part of my personality. I can't help it. But
that's cool.
So
go ahead.
So I think that's the sources. And so that's how you approach this book. But how did the book get made? And Alex is going to take us through that.
Okay. So once you started getting this idea, collecting research, at what point were you like, okay, this would be a good history book or a good comic history text? And then how did you approach different publishers? How did you approach them?
No, it's okay. I've been posting articles online and writing articles for over 20 years. Okay, going back to the mid 90s, and I've been fortunate. Most of the time, I've been approached by people who want to publish my stuff.
Yes,
and especially like Alter Ego. Roy Thomas has done it, several times, and he has a bunch of other articles of mine that are still sitting there. And one of the other guys who's done it was Craig Yo. Mm-hmm. And Craig's a great guy and everything.
Yeah, I love Craig. He's awesome.
Yeah. And I've done things for Craig in the past and stuff like that. Well, a few years back, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, he said, "Do you want to do a book?" Because usually people approach me for an article that I've already done, and they say, "Hey, can we publish that?" And then I'll do a few tweaks and they'll publish it. And he's the first one to say, like, "Do you want to do a book?" And see, part of the problem with the kind of stuff that I do is that I'm told all the time it's not commercial, because it's not about superheroes. I'm not writing about the Flash or the changes in Wonder Woman's costume or something like that. I'm writing about this historical type stuff that's pretty obscure a lot of times. And he was the first one who had the foresight, I guess, to say, "Do you want to do a book?" And I said, "Well, there's a lot of books I want to do." He said, "Well, what's one?" And the first one was Bernard Baily. And he agreed to that. I wrote an entire Bernard Baily book along with images and everything, and I gave it to him. I spent a year on it. And after I finished it, he goes, "Well," he says, "I don't know how commercial this will be." So he said, "Is there another one you want to do?" And even though I spent a year on this book, I said, like, "Well, I've always wanted to do a book." And I explained to him about the Black artist. I've done some articles like about Stoner that Alter Ego had published. But I said, I'd like to do an entire book. And I said, because there's a story here that's never been told. It's a part of comics history that we have a blind spot about. And I'd like to point that out. And he gave me free rein. He said, "Go for it." And I spent well over a year on it. And then through rewrites and stuff like that, probably 2 years writing it. And it's been finished for almost 2 years. And, over the past 2 years now, I gave him a lot of images and, he acquired some and stuff like that. And it was just a process. I think they did a great job with the design, him and his wife, Plezia. And I think they deserve all the credit in the world for that, because the visuals mean a lot in this book, I think. I think it gives a lot to just the story, of these men.
Yeah, for sure. And they're very effective because you have samples of photos, newspaper clippings, and actual comic book pages, which are they the comic book pages but are the newspaper clippings, is that public domain? How does that work?
Some of that stuff is just because of age and stuff. Some of these publications are totally out of business.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the things too, there's also you fall into a gray area of fair use and stuff like that. And most publications will let you use like a standing image and stuff like that without too much. Only one we really had to deal with really was a Sojourner Truth story from Wonder Woman comics. And we had to go through Warner Brothers there. And fortunately, I know a corporate lawyer at Warner Brothers, and he smoothed the way for us. And
oh, that's good.
Yeah. And that's how we were able to use that. Which was a big thing. I wish I could have used wish I could have used
that
things
can
from
be
DC
because it can be problematic. I mean, you gotta be careful.
Oh yeah, and like I say, that was part of the whole thing of putting the book together. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, because there's some history books that don't have any pictures because of that reason, right?
Right.
And, right. But the nice thing is a lot of these artists at the time they're working in companies that are defunct and no longer there, and you can actually use a lot of that stuff. So it creates quite a visual treat, and it's really nice for the audience to be able to read that and compare and contrast the different artists and their work. But also you make a point of certain aspects, which we're going to get into as we talk about. Each of us has picked one person from your book to discuss, but there are some interesting concepts, like how in World War II, a lot of the white men went off to fight the war. And so there's a vacuum, and you have the Rosie the Riveter type of presence in comics with white women in comics. But then you also have black men in comics that filled the void. That's one aspect. But then two, the shops, that there were comic shops like the Iger shop and Bernard Baily studio, and these different shops that would basically just take whatever work from whoever and sell it to publishers. And so then that created a way for black men to enter the industry. So first, let's, before we go to the different characters, when you started seeing these patterns, you know, was that fairly soon into the research, or was that years of research until you started realizing?
That was actually years into the research. It's funny you mention that, because it's hard to tell from just one or two guys exactly what was going on until I started reading some of their stories. And, you know, fortunately, some of these guys gave interviews about their work in comics. And it was interesting how they each made a reference how they themselves were didn't like or were afraid to deal with the white editors personally. So they worked through these, either they call them agents, or what it was comic shops. It was guys like Jerry Iger and Harry Chesler and Jack Binder and guys like that, who they would work through, who would get the jobs. And in turn, they would get their assignments from the comic shop and do it remotely in their own studios. Almost every one of these guys, Stoner had his own studio, which, you know, there's photographs of it, I think, in the book there, even in Greenwich Village. You know, Hollingsworth talked about dropping off stories. You know, he would get an assignment and he'd go drop it off, and then he'd go home, you know, and stuff like that. He was just a kid. But each one of these guys, they would work remotely, so they didn't even have to deal with the white editors. It was very interesting how it happened.
Yeah, there's almost like a little bit of a bypass to get
it was a buffer. It was a buffer between the white editors now, because they never knew what sort of reception they would get if they'd walk in there.
Right. Samuel Joyner, they didn't care. They just wanted to fill material, sell material. They didn't really care where it came from.
Right.
And then the editors are like, okay, cool. Well, this looks good. We'll print it. I mean, it's the perfect.
Right. You know, because comic books at that time were just concerned about content. That's all they cared about. They didn't care where it came from.
Right.
Just help me fill the 64 pages.
Also, another thing is how, let's say, if maybe the comic page of a particular artist may not look that great, there other art that they did, whether it's illustration or being sculptors or working at the mint or these other things that they did that were non-comics, were actually far better quality. So a lot of them were basically just trying to make some money through comics. And so you can't really judge the artist purely from the comic pages. Also, that's another concept I learned from you there. So let's talk about the different, a few people, you know, we've each picked one. The one that I really wanted to talk about was Adolphe Barreaux, originally named Adolphus Barreaux Grippon. Tell us a little bit about your awareness of him and his involvement in the early comics, and let's talk a little bit about him.
Okay, well, Barreaux was an interesting person. He was one of the people I had on a list of may have been black or may have been partially black, because that was one thing I did is early on, is I started creating a list of people who may have been black, and I kept talking to different people and accessing different forums and stuff like that. And he was one of the people who was on it. And so I was never really sure. But a few years ago, Craig, my publisher, he said he'd heard that Barreaux was black. And he said, will you follow up on that? And I said, okay. So I started putting more research into it. And sure enough, through genealogical research, he was black. I mean, he was definitely black.
This is cool. As you and Craig, it's almost like a Perry White, Clark Kent thing going on. With you guys.
Yeah, we worked really good together. I mean, it was good. But so I followed up on it, and he was definitely black. And what happened is he was raised by an aunt basically. And they moved from South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, to New York City. And when they did that, they changed their last name and they changed their identity because they had such light skin. They started passing as white. Mm-hmm. And he basically made up an entire mythology about his past. He would refer to his mother coming from Poughkeepsie, New York. And,
right.
You know, it was just very bizarre how he just created an entire new identity. But that new identity allowed him access to things he never would have had if people had known he was black. Like I said, he went to Yale. He never would have got into Yale if they'd known he was black. Uh-huh. I looked into the qualifications to get into Yale at that time. And though they didn't expressly say if you're black, you couldn't get in, they highly discouraged any black students going to Yale at that time. Mm. So he knew if they'd known he was black, it wouldn't have happened. And he ended up working entirely in white media. He never worked in black media. He was the only one of these artists I found like that who never worked in the black media at all. And he totally created this different persona to the point that even later in life, and even though I didn't publish these letters, he was writing letters to his hometown paper in Charleston, South Carolina, talking about his friend Strom Thurmond and his friend Mendel Rivers, who are segregationists. And he belonged to the Sons of the Confederacy organization and stuff like that. Very bizarre, from, our perspective to see it.
Yeah.
But
there's almost like a self-hating aspect to that.
Well, again, I don't want to get into a person's mind. I don't know exactly, but it was very strange how he almost went to the extreme. I mean, his son worked for Richard Nixon. Okay. If you look his son, you can look his son up right now. And he still was a prominent member of the Republican Party. Okay. They all record themselves as being white. Okay. Mm-hmm. There's no reference at all to being partially black or anything. And so that's always been a sensitive subject. So by my publishing this, I don't know if I'm going to get threatened or something now or whatever, but again, he was a unique guy, but it was what he must have determined he had to do to succeed, because he never would have succeeded as well as he did.
Mm-hmm. Right. And he also went to DeWitt Clinton High School. Is that right? In the 1910s. And that's where Bob Kane and Eisner went?
Yeah, Eisner went there. Actually, Stan Lee went there.
Yeah. This is an interesting, but that almost like 20 years before them, right?
Right. He's much older than them.
He's actually much older, but that's fascinating, right? How much of like early comics is coming from this high school.
Well, all those New York high schools it's ridiculous. If you look at the classes that they had there, the different students, like the School of Music and Art and Industrial Arts School and all that.
Yeah. And and that's cool that you actually talked about the formation of the School of Industrial Arts and what was going on around that, what in like the later 30s. Right. But what's cool is because Neil Adams went there like in the 50s or something. So
and Hollingsworth ended up teaching there.
Yeah. See, so it's just really interesting. The high schools and these kind of like training schools of New York and then comics. And that's cool that you go into that in your book, because you don't really see the origins of those schools in other books, actually. So just another cool thing, another cool treat from your book. So then now more about Barreaux. A lot of people, I don't know if the fans know, but just to kind of throw it out there, that he was actually working in the pulps with Harry Donenfeld, who was I like how you described him, a printer with mob connections who would acquire publishers that defaulted on printing expenses. Right. And that's actually like that sentence. Again, there's many reasons why I love the way you phrase a lot of the things you did, but that sentence really summed him up, his early involvement in comics, because there's a whole question of acquiring DC Comics that way. But let's talk a little bit more about Barreaux. He actually did some comics, Sally the Sleuth for Donenfeld's Spicy Detective Stories pulp magazine, but then also was in the drew the Magic Crystal of History in the first New Fun, 1935, under Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. So he's actually important in the early comics period. And then that Magic Crystal of History was extended in the Enchanted Stone of Time in the Comics by Dell going through 1938. So tell us a little more background about Adolph Barreaux. He married an Italian, I guess. And then there was another thing you put, he had illustrations in Collier's and Snappy Stories. Let's see,
well,
other things.
I just recently, again, on my blog, on my follow-up blog, Invisible Men, I just showed all these illustrations that he had done earlier for George Matthew Adams, who was a syndicator of comic strips. Most of the stuff that George Matthew Adams syndicated was stuff that was like all homespun type of homilies and things like that, and poems and comic strips. So it was something totally different from what you would expect Barreaux to be involved in. Mm-hmm. But it was at the same time, it's like 1937, 38, 39, 40. And he did these illustrations for these homespun homilies that George Matthew Adams would do. And it's, again, something totally, at the same time he was doing snappy stories and semi-pornography for Harry Donenfeld, he was drawing these illustrations for probably the most old school right-wing type of newspaper columnist that there was. Just very interesting. Was very complex man in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And then also he had his own art studio, Majestic Studio, that Donenfeld actually funded his art studio. Right. Then he also was part of when Worth Carnahan started Champion Comics, that later became Harvey. That was, you mentioned that could have been actually bankrolled by Donenfeld as well, but Worth Carnahan actually hired Barreaux to work on strips for those early comics that ended up becoming Harvey Comics, and Barreaux was actually working for them through 1941.
It's very complicated, and that was purposely done, Alex. There was so much stuff that was done behind the scenes because they were trying to hide, guys were trying to hide money, right? Here, especially a guy like Donenfeld. He had his fingers in so many different companies. It wasn't funny.
And you're saying it was more for tax purposes?
Tax purposes, and I'm sure that there was monies that he probably had illegally that he didn't want the government to know about. And if he could fund somebody to start up a company where he didn't have to have his name on the papers at all, but probably got some of the profits out of it, I'm sure that's what was happening. And Worth Carnahan was an established illustrator, long before he knew Barreaux, and he became part of Barreau's studio. But in theory, Barreaux ended up working for him, on those few comic books. But who knows? I mean, it could have just been all in name only. It could have just been a Donenfeld enterprise where they just put Worth Carnahan's name on it, and they were all just working. It was Barreau's studio doing it, but just with Carnahan's name on the publication.
Oh, interesting.
Like I said, cool. There's so much razzle dazzle going on. It's almost impossible to figure it all out.
Right. It's just a paperwork trail, kind of. And then also Barreaux worked on Donenfeld's Trojan magazines through his studio, which all ended about the mid 1950s. So that's almost a 20-year association with Harry Donenfeld that Barreaux had. Yeah. What's that? Show us that again there, Ken.
Yeah, that's it. Right. This is one of the issues right here.
Okay. It's a little blacked out from the virtual background, but I was able to see part of that, and that's awesome that you have that.
I got a lot of these. This prints that famous Sally the Sleuth story, the one where they ended up in Seduction to the Innocent.
Yeah.
That's in this story right here. Again, I see it's breaking up on the screen, but
we thought we were able to see the title and some of the art. That's awesome. And And what's fascinating is him and Donenfeld, like, it's, again, I know you don't want to get into their minds, but it sounds like they had some trusting working relationship going on for a long time.
He must have. I mean, he was associated with Donenfeld going back to when Donenfeld bought the Police Gazette back in the early 30s. Mm-hmm. And when Merle Hersey was put in control of Police Gazette, one of the artists that they hired was Barreaux, and he did a comic strip for him. Mm-hmm. And from that time on, he became like Donenfeld's, go-to guy for illustrations in his spicy magazines.
Right. Which, if a lot of people don't know, Sally the Sleuth, she was actually, in some ways, empowering in that she was a female, almost a hero or a detective hero, but there's a lot of, obviously, it was about getting her naked half the time.
Right. By the end of the story, she usually had almost no clothes on.
Right. And still talking to the cops with a straight face, with her boobs out.
Right. Yeah.
Hey guys, looks like you're a little late to the party.
Right. Yeah. It was a very strange concept, but it sold, I guess. I don't know.
It definitely sold. And then also, just to kind of wrap him up a little bit, is that he was a photo special interest books editor and writer for Fawcett. Yes. That's probably after their comics line was gone, and he's more on the book end of things. Worked in a New Jersey paper, like you said, friends with Strom Thurmond, and he died in 1985, so he was around for a good while. Any last notes on Adolphe Barreaux until Jim talks about his preferred person to chat about?
Nothing. Just like I said, there's a lot more about his personal philosophies and stuff like that at some point, I think I'll share some of the letters and stuff like that he wrote to some of these magazines and to newspapers and stuff like that. He was just, like I said, he's a very complex guy, and it's really hard to know, exactly what was going on with him all the time and that. But it just, like I say, he's totally divorced himself from his Black identity, which is, it makes him a difficult person to figure out. You can't hold him up really as a hero, but at the same time, you understand why he did what he did. Yeah, because to him, it was the only way he could succeed.
Right. More of a survivor than a hero, probably.
Exactly. That's an excellent way of putting it.
All right, Jim.
Well, Alex, actually, Ken's going to go next, but I wanted to, in this exercise, I wanted to ask each of us why you picked the person that you picked out of the choices. So what was it that drew you personally to this story as compared to some of the others?
Well, the number one is that Barreaux was there during some of the earliest comics periods, and then his relationship with Donenfeld, who obviously also had his hand in quite a lot of golden age comics companies. So there's something about Barreaux and being part of that gestating period from which a lot of the modern comic books come from. It's almost like Lloyd Jacquet in a way, where a lot of people don't talk about him, but he was editor of the New Fun One, which was started DC, but he also had obvious involvement in the first Marvel Comics one, also from his studio. So again, it's like Jacquet and Barreaux are just really interesting figures to me. And then there's also this weird self-hating aspect to Barreaux that I found somewhat fascinating too. So if I can call it that, I'm not sure. That's my assumption, but that's why.
Yeah, that's, I think that's a fair assumption. But again, I didn't want to state that in the book, right, because I can't read the man's mind. Right.
That's an editorializing.
It's funny you bring up Lloyd Jacquet, though, because I got a huge file on him that I'm just waiting to put together one of these days. You'll be amazed at the stuff that he was involved in. Lloyd Jacquet, to me, was possibly the most overlooked important person in the history of comics,
right?
Because he was involved in so much in the early days of comics. Did the first DC comic, the first Marvel comic. I mean, he did a lot of stuff and a lot of innovations that happened in the early years of comics came directly from Lloyd Jacquet. And there's more things involved with his personal life. It's going to surprise a lot of people when I
see that I'd read that tonight if I could. So yes.
Yeah, like I say, with Lloyd Jacquet, I got a whole personal letters of his that he wrote to his wife. I got his military files I got from the government. So I got a lot to work with him. You guys gonna be surprised when that's one of the projects I want to finish this year.
Yeah, that's great. I'm excited about that. That's huge.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to let you go next because it makes sense for you to do Stoner before before we talk about Hollingsworth.
Okay. Well, to me, Elmer Stoner is the most important Black artist of all. More important than Matt Baker or Hollingsworth or anybody else. Elmer Stoner was this talented, fine, classically trained fine artist. He went to studied in Europe. He studied in France, and he came back in France from France in 1922. He's from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and his family wasn't wealthy, wasn't poor necessarily. His father was a pastor and all this stuff, but they were all very well educated. A lot of it was homeschooling and stuff like that at the time. And anyways, he ended up going to study in Paris, and became a classically trained fine artist. In 1922, he came back, and he participated in this art show. It was the Negro Artist Exhibition. It was held at the Harlem Library in 1922. And that's considered a seminal moment in Black artwork in the United States, because that was the first time Black artists had their own art exhibition anywhere in the United States. And it was all these famous artists who happened to exhibit at the same time. And one of those artists was Elmer Stoner. The next year, he married this woman named Vivian Stokes, who was herself a very accomplished woman. She was an activist. She was a social worker. She worked for the National Urban League. And at the time when he married her, she'd just been appointed an important position at the YWCA, where she overlooked something for an entire nation for finding housing for Black women whose husbands had fought in World War I. And there was no housing for the women who were left home, left behind. Anyways, she was an important woman in the early years of civil rights. Well, he married her in 1923, and they in turn became integral to the whole Harlem Renaissance. They belonged to a literary group that included Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and stuff like that. And they befriended all these famous people, and were all part of the same group. Well, Stoner, for his part, worked very little in the Black media. The only thing I've ever found was this one thing called The Messenger, which was 1924 issues that he worked on. And The Messenger was the most important Black magazine published at that time, literary magazine, and he was one of the illustrators for it. So he was this well-established fine artist for years before he even got into comics, almost 20 years before he got into comic books. And the way he got into comics was the way a lot of Black artists did, and even Jewish artists. And that was through the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which was established by Roosevelt back in the 30s. And what the creation of the WPA was to find work for unemployed artists at the time. And they put them to work doing things like painting murals on libraries, or, for different projects around the country they would find for them. Well, one of the projects he worked on was the World's Fair, the 1940 World's Fair, 3940 World's Fair, and he did a lot of work there. But what happened in 1940 is the WPA went away because it was defunded by Congress. So when it was defunded by Congress, what it did, it threw a lot of these artists out of work. They had no work at all. And most of the artists were minority artists. They were the Black artists and Jewish artists. And I'm talking about artists like Louis Fairstadt, who was a fine artist. He ended up working in comic books. Mac Bois was another one who worked for WPA. who was put out of work, and they all drifted into comic books because that was the only job they could find. And with everything else, it was just, the timing. But he started in comic books in 1939. There's rumors that he worked on Detective Comics #1, which he didn't. And even by his own words, I found him where he talks several times about starting in comics in 1939. And he was working basically through the Jack Binder studio at the time until he went off on his own and he worked out of his own home. But he served as a conduit for later Black artists to come in. And again, there was references several times to artists saying how, it was thanks to Stoner that they even got into comics. But it's more than coincidental that, to me, that there was a lot of early artwork, like for instance, by Hollingsworth. Some of Hollingsworth's first artwork was in comic books like the Blue Beetle. Like he did Bronze Man and the Blue Beetle as a backup feature in a couple of issues. That was a comic book basically done entirely by Elmer Stoner. Owen Middleton, the only published comic bearing his name, appeared in a comic book called War Heroes. It was published by Dell, but was almost entirely done by Stoner, other than that one story. So a lot of these early artists were connected to Stoner, and he would serve as an entry point for them into comic books. And to me, that's what makes him so important, to the comic book history. And afterwards, he actually published comics too. He did a few comics on his own, but he continued making promo comics right up through the 50s, up to about 1957. He was still working for Vital, doing a lot of promotional comics. So he had the longest career, of any of the Black comic artists. And he was important, before and after, his whole comic book career. Just a fascinating man, just a really fascinating man.
That's great. I wanted there because that's why I did it in that order, because he seemed significant, because certainly to Hollingsworth, he's very significant. And it seems like his name pops up, Stoner's name pops up over and over in your book, right, in chapters. So does Bernard Baily's.
Right.
Too.
Yeah.
Which, especially in the context of who I want to talk about, well, I want you to talk about to me, which is Hollingsworth, because Baily really is significant, I think, in his both comic career and his later career.
Right. Yeah, Hollingsworth is an interesting guy. He's another guy who was a tremendous talent. He started working in comic books when he was in junior high, and that was basically through Joe Kubert, who was a junior high buddy of his, and he got him working through the Charles Quinlan Studio at first. He just did a few backup things, for Quinlan, but it was really through Baily that he first got his real. His first published work, bearing his own name and stuff like that. And it was like things like Bronze Man and stuff like that. Well, later on in his career, he ended up working for Baily again in Baily's men's magazines, which was kind of interesting. Baily was a publisher by this time in the late 50s. And he went to Hollingsworth, and he became an illustrator for his men's magazine. He did some really interesting, I think, modern artwork, like for Baily's things. I put some of that on my blog. And
this was in in several things,
right.
High magazine.
Yeah, it was these two weird magazines called High and Ho. Okay, they're very bizarre. They're a weird format magazine. They were half-size magazines. They were fully the size of a regular magazine, tall-wise, but only half size going across, so they could fit in the vest pocket of a gentleman's suit coat, is the way they put it. And anyways, Baily published these magazines for several years, and Hollingsworth was a regular contributor. And one of the things he contributed to it was this series of sketches he did of Harlem, which I think was really interesting. It was like a 3-page pictorial that he did for for one of the Baily's magazines based on his Harlem sketches, which in turn led to a whole series of paintings that he did later on.
The way I read it, as you wrote it, it was almost as if Baily saw, well, the way it's framed is Baily saw it and said, I want to put this in the magazine.
Right. Baily had, again, he's one of the more fascinating characters ever to appear in comics. I don't want to go into him too much right now because I had this entire book written about him. But he had a keen eye for talent. I mean, he gave Frank Frazetta his first opportunity to work in comics. And there's a lot of guys who worked for Baily. Charles Voigt, who was a fantastic old-time artist, who was an alcoholic and couldn't get any jobs. And Baily hired him literally off the street. And the only artwork he ever did was in comic books, was for Baily, for Bernard Baily. John Junta did some fantastic stuff while working for the Baily shop. Like I said, if this book's ever published, it's a beautiful, beautiful compilation of artwork.
I'm really intrigued by that because and your piece here got me. I mean, I was aware of Baily and a lot of his contributions, but reading this and about High Magazine and spotting those Harlem drawings and wanting to put them, that was really intriguing to me. I like this chapter so much because there was like the friendship with Joe Kubert, which was surprising to me because you have these concepts of black and white and they're not being in the comics thing, not being the connections, that it's segregated almost. And they went to the same high school and before that, but Kubert encouraged him to go to the School of Industrial Art. And the fact that was in somewhere that he could go to was somewhat surprising to me.
Right.
Talk about that just for a second.
Well, you mean about the high school?
Because that comes up in your book more than once. Alfonso Greene went to that school too, right?
Well, he went to a different one. They went to let me think. Kubert and Hollingsworth, I believe, went to music and art. But Alfonso Greene and Ezra Jackson went to the industrial art high school. They're all similar. So what it was is back in the 30s, Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York, introduced all these vocational schools, basically. And they're what I guess they call them nowadays, they call them magnet schools, where any student in the city who was qualified, you would test into these schools. You had to pass a series of tests to get into these schools. And if you had any talents like artwork or dance or singing or writing or whatever, you would have to pass a series of tests to get into these schools. So it was like the best of the best would get in, no matter where you're from. And so it was a unique opportunity for minorities a lot of times to actually get real training, whereas they wouldn't get it if they went to their own schools in their own neighborhoods. And I think it was a great concept. I don't know if, how well it still works, right now, but at the time it was really, unique opportunities for these kids.
And based upon reading your own chapter, I think Hollingsworth did go to School of Industrial Art, but he taught when he went back to teaching.
Okay, yeah, I get confused. Like I said, I get the two confused because they changed their names too, which makes it kind of confusing. Yeah.
But I thought that was really that was interesting. The racial identity aspect of Hollingsworth. Let's talk about that for a second, because he was not African American, descended from slaves the way that some of the others were. And he's West Indies, right?
I believe so. Like I say, that's one of the interesting things I talked to Alex about a little bit before. And that's the reason why I specifically refer to Black artists throughout the book and not African American. Because there's this concept we have in this country, we're assuming all Blacks are African American, but a significant amount we're not, and still are not. They're African Caribbean, or there's different ethnicities within the Black identity. And it's again, that's all a part of the thing which I try to get across in the book, that there's so many things as white people we're unaware of. And even within, the Black community, there was different degrees and different perceptions. West Indian Blacks were considered different than a lot of African-American Blacks, even within their own community. And that's a very interesting dynamic that they had going on there. They were almost like separate, a community within a community kind of thing.
And that carries over even today. Obama versus Michelle Obama were treated somewhat differently because or Kamala Harris and whether or not she's, quote, Black enough.
But there's this one called Cry City, was a series of paintings he did. And they're very powerful, compelling images that he has. And it's really something to see, and again, it's something that you wouldn't even think about when you think about a person as a comic book artist. I mean, when most people think about A.C. Hollingsworth, they think about horror comics or something like that. And then you see this entirely different aspect of a person, artistic aspect. And that's, like I say, it's frustrating in one sense because I can only touch on so much, in such a limited space. But I just hope that, all these stories lead people to, go more into these stories and try to find out more about these men in the completeness of their lives, because each one of them is so rich and so full of, fascinating information.
Well, that was I think the aspect of Hollingsworth that why I was drawn to him, because he went back, he realized he wasn't going to make his living at comics, efficient living, and he went back to school. And he didn't just go back to school for a course. He went through, I don't know if he completed his Ph.D., but he was in a Ph.D. program.
Right. Yeah, because that's always been kind of vague, because he would refer to it as being in a Ph.D. program, but I also noticed he never used Ph.D. after his name, even when he was teaching. So I don't know. It's it's one of those things I'm not sure about.
And I'm always fascinated by artists who go back to school and they come out with different training and they're different artists. And certainly he becomes more abstract and his work is really interesting. Although you mentioned the zombie story that you and that is the other reason I picked him, because I was just that open splash page.
He was a great comic book artist, but his fine art was totally different, and that's what's amazing about each one of these men. They're just, you see different identities, that they had, artistic identities, which people don't. You always assume somebody having a style, like there's the Kirby style or the Ditko style, but there's more to a person, and especially these guys who had. They have fine art training. It's just entirely different. Stoner is another perfect example to me. If you look at the work that Stoner did outside of comics, you wouldn't even know it's the same human being. It just amazes me.
That's what, and I would love to have a book that showed that. I think the definitive book on the WPA art, and contrasted with the comics and the influence of it back and forth on before and after and everything else is really interesting to me. And I wish we had a good book on that.
Yeah. Well, like I say, I'm hoping that this book kind of triggers an interest that will lead to other books, that bring these aspects of comics history and stuff like that to the general public. Because, again, like I said, I've always been told that a lot of this stuff is too esoteric and too obscure to interest the book-buying public. And it took me, until Craig came along, nobody even bothered to want to publish this, because they always figured, there's only a handful of people who are interested. And maybe if, enough people buy this book, it'll open up doors for other writers and, other aspects of comics history.
Well, I will tell you this. I read this on the PDF, for both purposes and for this. And then about maybe last Wednesday or so, my mother-in-law sent it to me as a present, because she's trying to figure out what to give me.
Yeah.
it was after the New York Times piece, and
okay.
I knew it. I called her up and I thanked her. I said, "Did you get that from the New York Times?" And she said, "Yeah, I know. I don't know if you know that." And I'm like, I'm interviewing him in like two days. It's going to be good. And I got to say, for anybody listening, it really needs to be owned as that book, because I mean, as much as I enjoyed reading it on my iPad, it's not the same experience. And holding that and seeing it in print makes a real difference.
Oh yeah, I've had several people say that, because we sent out a few PDFs and that, then people got the book and they go, wow. Like I said, I think Craig and Klitzy did a fantastic job with the design of the book and that. I personally think that they should get some sort of design award for it, but
I
partial.
Personally like my mother-in-law more because of your book. So, which maybe we don't have to. No, that's fine. So, anyway, because she's not going to listen. So I just the couple other things I just want to say super quickly on Hollingsworth was the school, his high school experience. When I went to the next chapter and his success and how he lived and just his entire life story, and then I go to the next chapter and it's Alfonso Greene and it's like the opposite story, even though the same school. So just tell us just for a second, why I'm saying that.
Well, Alfonso Greene, and who tipped me off of this was Alex Toth, in that famous, he wrote, I don't know if it's famous, but a well-known article some years ago. He wrote about Alfonso Greene, who he went to high school with. And he talked about this troubled kid who had been in and out of trouble with gangs and stuff like that. And he never knew what happened to him or anything like that. So he fascinated me right from the get-go. And I knew a little bit about him. Well, unfortunately, most of Alfonso Greene's story comes from the negative side, because he did belong to gangs and that. And he was in trouble. He was in prison off and on. I mean, he had a good gig going with DC Comics. But while he was in high school, he was drawing, a backup feature for in Wonder Woman and Sensation Comics called The Black Pirate. And he also did the Sojourner Truth story for the Wonder Woman history for Wonder Woman comics. So even while he was in high school, he was talented enough to work for DC. But soon after, he went to jail for a gang fight he had been involved in. So he comes out of jail, in the later 40s, it's about 1947 or so. And he ends up working for Eastern Color in working on heroic comics, basically these 2- and 3-page stories that appeared in heroic comics, these true stories that they would publish, about, in comic book form. And he was doing a fairly steady work through them, and he got in trouble again and went back to prison again for some robbery at that time. He belonged to something called what they call the Lemon Gang or something like that, because what they did is they were robbing people and shoving a lemon in their mouth when they would rob them, so they couldn't talk. It was kind of bizarre story, but he was involved in that and went to prison again. So around 1950 or so, he comes out again and he ends up working for Atlas and Stan Lee, and he works for them fairly steadily right up until the implosion about 1957 or so. And then he disappears. And there was nothing, I could find for years afterwards, and still little bits and pieces, until finally I came across some references to him being involved again in a robbery with 3 other guys outside the Waldorf Astoria in New York in the early 60s. And I found the booking photo of him, unfortunately. And that's the photo I had to use in the book. That's the only photo I could ever find of him, because he wasn't even in his high school yearbook. But it's just a tragic story, because he was a very talented artist and from a young age, but he just went the wrong way, and that's life, and that's the whole thing with these stories here. Each person has a fascinating story behind them.
And that when I read those back to back, the question I would have is, were you doing these when you're packaging this? Are you doing this simply in a more chronological way, or are you playing with the narrative to some degree? Because it was jarring to go from that to the other back to back.
I know it seems like I was, but actually it was pretty much chronological. If you look at the birthdays of each one of those guys, it goes from the firstborn, which was either Barreaux or Stoner. I can't remember.
Barreaux's the first one.
Yeah.
Okay. It goes from Barreaux to Stoner to Pius, J. Jackson, Elton Fax, and it's pretty much chronological. In the way they were born. But I agree with you in that, his two stories against each other are pretty jarring. When you see the how the different lives. Same thing with Ezra Jackson. I mean, Ezra Jackson literally was in the same class as Alfonso Greene. Yet again, he had a fairly decent run in comics there until he left, and he came back into comic books later on in the 60s and 70s, ironically enough, working for Myron Fass, doing some of those weird shock comics and stuff like that. There were knockoff Warrens. I don't know if you guys remember those at all.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
But, yeah, some of those real horrible horror comics and that. But he also he worked for the Golden Legacy series that was done by Fitzgerald, which was Black History Comics, done in the 60s. And his daughter is Sheila Jackson Lee, one of the most powerful congresswomen in Congress.
Yeah.
Which is a fascinating story. Every year, she would read a tribute to her father before Congress in the Congressional Record on Father's Day. There's a tribute to him, and she always mentions his comic book work.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And I just think that's really cool, that she does that. But again, there was nothing ever known about this guy. And it's so funny. His person he was partnered with most of the time was Maurice Whitman, who's a fairly well-known comic book artist. Early on, they would switch off, penciling and inking, each other's work. And, they did a combination of their names. But when I went and asked his son, Maurice Whitman's son, if he had any memories of his father talking about working with Ezra Jackson, he swore to me his father never worked with a black man at any time in his life. So, which I just thought was interesting. So either one, he didn't know about it, or two, Maurice Whitman just cut that part out of his story, and they worked together for a number of years.
Oh, see, that's really fascinating.
And so there's a lot of, stuff that goes on in the background. You just don't know what sort of dynamic these people had. Did they not like each other? Did he just want to not acknowledge the fact that he worked with a black guy? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's the question, and the unanswered question.
Right.
And you not to try to answer it if you don't know the answer. And
exactly. And see, as I said, again, Jim, what I do is I present the facts, and I leave it up to the reader to try to figure out what's going on. I mean, they don't, I don't know any more than they do. So
we covered the people, but the one that it seems almost like the chapter that's not just about the artist was your chapter on All-Negro comics, and Alex is going to
talk
about that.
Right.
So the discussion of All-Negro comics is interesting because it's actually a black-made comic, and that's important because it becomes almost an extension of what you've been calling the black media in a way, but in a way that actually was accessible to a lot of white readers at the time, and also within the context of there was a previous comic book that had a couple issues called Negro Heroes 1 and 2, which was actually more of a white-made comic. But so that's an interesting thing that would kind of precede that one. And we can't really talk about All-Negro comics without mentioning Orrin Evans, who was kind of the person behind it. So tell us first about Orrin Evans and the creation of All-Negro comics. And that also then goes into some involvement by some of his cohorts, George Evans, his younger brother, William H. Smith, Leonard Cooper, John H. Terrell. So tell us about this movement of All-Negro comics.
Well, Orrin Evans was an established journalist. He was one of the first black journalists to work in a white newspaper. And this is going back, I believe, to the 1920s when he first started his career. And he would work in white newspapers. And anyway, by the 1940s, he was working for
the Philadelphia Record.
Yeah, Philadelphia Record. Thank you. I was trying to think of the last which paper it was. Well, the paper went out of business, and when the
and it was actually because of like he was pro-union, but the unions kind of took down his newspaper, which is an odd thing.
Right. It was again, it gets a very complicated story when you start getting in the union involvement in that. And basically, what it was is the paper rather shut down than work with the unions. Okay, so that's what they did. They closed down the newspapers. So what Evans did is he recruited a couple of the other editors that he'd worked with on the paper and some of the business people, and they formed like their own publishing company, and he called it All-Negro Comics, and he was the head of it. He was the president of it, and his concept was to publish a comic book totally created by Black artists and creators. And he started with obviously his brother George is his younger brother, and his brother had friends who went to school with him at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and he recruited several of them. It was this I believe William Smith and Leonard Cooper and stuff like that were some of the guys he worked with, who went to school with. He recruited them to work on the comic. And they also recruited this guy named John Terrell. And John Terrell had already been working in comics off and on in Black media. He'd done something for the New York, Amsterdam News back in the early 40s. And at the time,
Judge Humor magazine, something like that.
Right. He did like some of these panel cartoons and stuff like that. So he'd done some professional cartoon work. And he was the only one who's really a professional cartoonist coming into this. All the rest were just college students at the time.
Right. Like they just came out of the Museum of Art schools. That's what.
Right.
That was the big thing there.
Yeah. Yeah. Ironically enough, Samuel Joyner, the guy who got me into this whole thing, he went to school with these guys at exactly the same time, but he wasn't one of the guys who was recruited for this. It's ironic. It's just ironic.
Wow.
How that all worked out. But anyways, so Evans, came up with this concept, and they created this All-Negro Comics. And right from the get-go, they had problems because of distribution. There's a lot of white retailers and stuff wouldn't even put the comics on newsstands, particularly like anywhere outside of going south or anything like that. So by the time, even though they completed the second issue, and it supposedly exists somewhere, from what I've heard, there's members of the Evans family say that the issue still exists somewhere, that it was never published because they couldn't get any of the paper dealers to sell them paper to do the printing of the second issue because they were Black. And so it was, it was just it was a good, attempt, but it just never worked out, and, who knows what would have happened, if it would have caught on, but it would have been a very difficult sell anywhere on any newsstands because, anytime a Black would appear on a cover, it was usually in a comedic sense or as a villain and never as a hero,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this is interesting because they had that one issue, and then there was some issues with printer supply paper of some kind.
Right, that's what it was. It was they wouldn't sell them paper.
Why is that? Is it because they just didn't generate the money to buy the paper? What happened?
Well, again, what the family claims is that it was discrimination just because they were Black. They wouldn't sell to them because they were Black. I don't know if that's true, but that's what the family claims is, the situation.
Which is tragic. That's a terrible thing. Yeah. If that was the case, yeah.
Yeah, right. Again, do I believe it? Yeah, I believe that it's a fact, but I also think that, there's enough paper retailers around the time that, they should have been able to find somebody, but maybe there wasn't enough money, generated by the first issue. I don't know, because it didn't get wide distribution. That's why it's such a rare comic today.
Yeah. There you go. So distribution and then maybe some low money.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because see, there was a definite bias against putting blacks on the cover of
a newsstand
comic book. Yeah, like let me just show you something real quick. I don't know if you guys can see this Crown Comics.
Yeah, with the horns.
Yeah, with the black eye on there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this comic book here is the comic that publishes Voodah, the first black hero to ever appear in a comic book, and was drawn by Matt Baker.
Yeah.
Well, Voodah was never depicted on the cover as a black character. The only time they would show Voodah on the cover, but he was colored white.
Yes.
But on the interior for the first 6 issues, he was black.
Yes.
On the interior. And that was purposely done because retailers in the South wouldn't put a comic on the stands with a positive black character on the front.
Right. This is interesting, this whole race changing, because what I think Red Mask, had that happened to Red Mask in 39 or so, where it was like he was black in the first couple, then it became a white character. And even later on, I mean, in the late 60s with that Jericho guy from the Teen Titans, and there's some issue with Southern distribution, so they made him a white character at DC. So I guess this is just something that happened.
I think that may have been coloring. I'm not sure they could make, because Jericho. Wait, are you talking about? Talking about Mal Duncan?
I don't know Mal Duncan. I know the code name. Maybe we're talking about the same character.
Mal originally is the black guy that joins the Titans, and later
he becomes Cyborg, right?
Yeah. What's that?
Isn't he become Cyborg or
no? Different guy.
But he gets Jericho's horn at one point. But I don't. I think there's some coloring issues, but I don't think they ever convert him to a white person within the narrative. That'd be hard to. Oh, but it's complicated because he has a relationship with, or there's a hint of a relationship with Lilith, and that has driven people crazy. But I don't think they could have made Mal actually white because he was so,
right. There's the way it's drawn, but the coloring though was altered.
Yeah, there's an interesting early issue of him where he goes into space and he's floating in space and he has a helmet on. And I don't know if he's got perspiration coming out, but if he does, it's perfect because it's that reference to
the EC comics with the Judgment Day.
Judgment Day.
Yeah.
Okay.
Joe Orlando. Yeah. So yeah, and then also just to conclude Orrin Evans' story, everyone goes their separate ways. He worked for a newspaper in Pennsylvania. And I like how you write the mechanism of death in some of these, but he died of an aneurysm in 1971, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So
that's pretty interesting. And then I think Jim has some follow-up questions, and then we conclude.
One of the things that I liked about your book the most, Ken, besides the comic book aspect, is these other things that watching how you navigate it, but how it's sort of a mapping of certain aspects of that time period. And I just want to go through 3 real quick that I think one can learn a lot from that book, even if you're not a comic book person necessarily. And the first one was literally mapping in terms of racism and different places in the country and how the narratives are different based upon the people growing up in New York, or the first person growing up in the South, or being a Southerner, or in West. And I wanted to ask it in the context of what you learned while you were doing this in relation to regions, and what surprised you or you found fascinating about America based upon where they were stationed at.
Well, it's funny you say that because this book, like a whole thing, was a learning experience for me, because unfortunately, we've had basically one story, one perspective told about about history in this country. And as a white person, you never considered the Black perspective. And to realize that, different parts of the country, like you mentioned there, had different ways of dealing with, with their Black populations. Like, for instance, like I didn't know until I was doing research for the book, like Baltimore was the first city in the country to have segregated neighborhoods, in the sense of where you were not legally allowed to sell a home to a Black person. You had to sell to a white person. Now you think of Baltimore, at least I always had, is like a northern city. And to think of that happening, and it happened within, in the 1910s and 15s, right around there, that there's different parts of the country, were racist, but they're racist in their own way, in more subtle ways. And it's something that I didn't realize until I started doing this research. And again, it's all part of that, the dual identity thing, which Blacks had to deal with, which a white person never even noticed it. But a Black person was very aware of it. If they were going to go buy a home, there was literally red-lined areas where they could not physically buy a home. And that was happening in northern cities as well as, Black community and southern cities. And, we have a tendency to put all the blame in this country, racism, on the South, but it was systemic. It was throughout the entire country, but it was more benign in the sense of like, it wasn't in your face so much as just established societal boundaries that the Blacks had to deal with a lot of times. And that, I think, was even shown in the way they had to deal with editors. Even though they were in New York City, the liberal bastion of New York City, Blacks did not feel comfortable dealing with white editors, and white editors didn't feel comfortable dealing with Blacks. And that includes somebody like Stan Lee. I don't know if you saw that one instance there where Calvin Massey talks about dealing with Stan Lee. And when I read that was kind of shocking to me in one sense, because, Stan Lee employed more Blacks than any other editor by far, but at the same time, he probably also had his own biases too.
Right. He kind of sang like some derogatory poem back at him.
Right.
And
yeah.
And Massey was like, what the hell? Okay. And then he started leaving. Stan was like, all right. Well, what do you got? And then, so.
Right. It was an old slave song, and it said Massa is buried in the grave, Massa meaning master, and he was doing a play on Massey's name. And Massey was shocked by Stan Lee singing it to him. This is in early 50s, like 1952.
Now, is that when Stan was wearing that propeller beanie hat?
But this is like in the early 50s.
Yeah.
And yet he came to know Stan Lee as not really a racist type guy. But, he had these attitudes, that was the attitudes of the people then. And it's something that, you come to realize when you're doing this research. It's hard to wrap a 21st century mind around a mid 20th century mind. I'm lucky in the sense of I've been around long enough. I've known people through, who grew up in the 1920s and 30s and stuff, like my parents and a lot of people I know. But their biases were intrinsic to them. And it wasn't something that they necessarily wore on their sleeve. It's just they felt interiorly. I don't know if you guys understand what I'm saying, but it's something that you see even in the way, they presented the comic books. It's hard for somebody to read The Spirit and overlook Ebony, for instance. That's always, you talk to somebody, you tell them how great The Spirit was, and then you see, the character of Ebony. How do you explain that to somebody? How can you look at artwork and remove the racism of it? And, that's something I struggle with all the time, when I'm doing this stuff, because I'm not oblivious to that. But at the same time, a lot of the stuff that we research, a lot of stuff that we love, these old comics have a lot of these attitudes, which, are just anathema to what, people believe nowadays. It's a very interesting dynamic, and it's a tightrope walk, I guess you have to walk all the time, when you're talking about these things. And I know you guys, you probably deal with that all the time, with, the comic book historians page, because
comes up every once in a while.
Yeah, no, but what I'm saying is, how far do you let people go? Because almost immediately people will, run to their corners,
right,
and stuff like that. And they just want to start espousing something or other, and it's hard to get people unemotionally to discuss these things, which I think is really unfortunate.
Right.
Because
I think for as many people as we have in the group, the 10,000 plus, for that amount, I think we're still able to maintain the best dialogue for that amount of people.
Right.
I think there's groups that have maybe a higher level of dialogue with only a few hundred people in them. And that, so I am glad that we're able to do that, but you're right. There's a certain tribalism that I think, as we were talking about off air, that's inherent in social media, that everything gets split into two sides, like on every issue, and then they just got to pound each other. And so how far do you let any of that go? And I think that's something that Jim and I wrestle with like all the time. Yeah.
And like I said, it's something you can't avoid when you're talking about Golden Age comics, because they're so different. The mindset behind them is so different than what
there's a lot of outrage, and that's true. And Trina Robbins said, you just got to look at this stuff within its context, discuss the context, and then talk about why that context doesn't work anymore. But then also kind of appreciate maybe whatever good you can get out of it and how formative that stuff could have been at the time. You got to do that. You got to throw context at it. I think a lot of people just get mad at a panel and they react because that's the, it's like meme culture, right? It's all about reacting to a quick thing.
Right.
There's two components to it. And one, I'd be critical of the left, one, I'd be critical of the right. There is that taking panels out of context or judging it in that quick way and saying, oh, we have to, or we reject the creator 100%. We recently had somebody posting that really awful one cartoon that Hank Ketchum did with the black guy, which the black kid. That's a very, very bad drawing of Stephen Fetchit looking kid next to Dennis the Menace, and people were just attacking Hank Ketchum, and Hank Ketchum may be a horrible human being. I don't know, and I don't care, because we would not have some of the art we have if not for Ketchum's influence, and I love him for that. And in comic book historians, we can isolate that and talk about it in terms of artistic influence. On the, I won't even say right, because it's not fair to the right, but there is when Superman Smashes the Klan came out, there were people that are defensive about the Klan because of Charlottesville and other things, and they wanted, why do we have to talk about the Klan? That's somehow politically correct, people wanting to bring that up, the Klan. And it's like, well, that's just stupid. And I just want to say it's stupid.
Right.
That's a radio program. The Klan, it's okay to make them evil. Nobody's attacking political parties because they're bringing up the Klan, and that created a lot of tension on this site.
Right.
So we all need to take a breath on that kind of things.
See, and I totally agree with that. See, and that's the unfortunate aspect of social media that I was talking to Alex about off the air, previously, is it creates these divisions, and creates these unnecessary fights with people, which really have nothing to do with what you're talking about in the first place anyway. Like you say, I love Will Eisner. I love Will Eisner's artwork, and in no way do I think the man was necessarily racist from his point of view. Was Ebony racist from our point of view? You can't get around it. Yes, he was. I mean, there's no way of looking at him and saying he wasn't, a racist characterization. But, from what I know about Eisner, and I know quite a bit, you can't say that was a racist comic and take it as that. It's not a fair characterization of him.
And I don't think he was racist himself specifically either. No.
And like I said, I've read hundreds of interviews with Will Eisner and things that he's written. I'm talking about going from like 1940 on. He was interviewed all the time. And but people also change over time too. We have. I mean, everybody changes over time, whether they believe it or not. I can guarantee, in 1970, I was a different person than I am today, 50 years later.
Of course.
And everybody is. And, that's the other thing that, we don't ever give people enough credit for the fact that they change over time. People evolve. We just got to relax. We just got to chill out a little bit.
But I would also say that as a white person, I'm not going to say Will Eisner wasn't a racist, because he's not, maybe to me as I perceive it. But if I was black and I read that,
oh yeah,
right to say, yeah, he's a racist.
Oh yeah, but I totally understand that.
And that's where individuals have their right to their perceptions.
Exactly.
But I think the Will Eisner that I'm thinking about, the guy from the 70s and on, I think he learned from those mistakes at that point.
Right.
I think Will Eisner 1940 is a different guy than Will Eisner 1977 Contract with God Will Eisner.
Yeah, but you can get, he doesn't always, just like anybody that's an older person that's dealing with their own racism, they're funneling it through their own thing. So you can find quotes, not where he's saying racist things, but where he's sounding defensive or he's confused, like it's just complicated. Race, incredibly complicated.
Right.
And I don't think there's one answer to any of those things about who's racist and who's not. It is in the eye of the beholder and the eye of the person that's having to experience it.
Exactly.
But that Stan Lee story though is really interesting. You never hear that about him. And again, that's like another cool thing about your book. There's just these things you point out that you have documentation for that you just never hear about. And even about people that we know, actually, which is awesome.
But to give Stan Lee credit, at the same time, Stan Lee also employed Calvin Massey, Alfonso Greene, Matt Baker, Warren Broderick. All these black artists worked for him.
Right.
And
his editorials on racism were very powerful at its time and well placed in the 60s when they were coming out. So,
like I say, it's a complex, sort of thing. To Hollingsworth, or to Massey, he may have, been a racist, but at the same time, he gave him a job. It's weird. EC Comics, as liberal as they were, never employed a black artist.
Right.
Whether it was Matt Baker. And I even talked to Al Feldstein about that some years ago. We had a discussion about that. He said he's ashamed. He told me he was ashamed to admit that he never employed a black guy. The only black person they employed was a secretary. Mm-hmm. He said, we never employed a black artist. And he says, I'm embarrassed by that. Can you say that?
Yeah. And honestly, I think that if you give someone a job, that shows a lot more than if you sound a certain way, but don't actually give them a job. I think that's, to me, the proof's in the pudding. And so I love the EC Comics and what it stood for, but like you said, it's far from perfect.
Exactly.
So we covered, I was going to mention industry, but I think we kind of covered that just in this little bit of conversation. The other, besides the region, one of the things I was curious what you learned about or felt like you understood more was education opportunities, specifically art training, but school and the impact on that and how that impacted these black artists, because a lot of them trained. And and was that surprising to you, what their experiences versus others?
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously almost every single one of these artists had a specialized art training. It's interesting if you compare it to a lot of the white Golden Age artists. A lot of the white Golden Age artists were self-trained, you know, just kids and stuff like that. And, you know, they became comic book artists. But the black artists, it's almost like they had to have another level of training to reach the same point that the white artists did. Because almost every single one of these black artists, either in high school or in college, they studied artwork, or they went to a specialized high school to learn artwork or something like that. None of them that I came across that I can think of just walked in off the street and became an artist.
Right. None of them were like apprenticed by a person.
Right. Right. And which I think was really interesting. When you compare that to most of the white comic book artists, they had
Joe Kubert. He joined like when he was like 13.
Well, right, and he brought in and he brought in Hollingsworth, and stuff like that.
That's right.
But even so, Hollingsworth wound up going to get in specialized training in high school.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And also the other thing too, which I think is interesting, which kind of struck me, was most of the black artists had very short careers in comic books, whereas white artists, you find guys who had multi-decade careers. They were comic book artists and they stayed comic book artists their entire lives. Where these black artists, it was only a stepping stone to something else, for most of them. Either they went into teaching or they became fine artists, or, they had other ambitions beyond comic books. And I just think that's interesting. It was just like I said, to me, it was an entry point into their lives, but it didn't define their lives like it does for a comic book artist. Like when you talk about Gil Kane, for instance, Gil Kane was always a comic book artist.
Yeah.
Steve Ditko, always a comic book artist. Even Jack Kirby, for all intents and purposes, was always a comic book artist. You don't find that with black artists, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
That was actually going to be my final one, was the notion of high art and how so many of your artists in your book went on to that. And one question I had was, and I realized with this generation, they weren't coming from fanboy perspective like right. Current artists are, but was the material that they were working with, the comic stuff that they were working with as white artists, maybe at least a little bit more there and personal and relatable than it was to the black artists who were doing things like White Jungle Girl kind of comics, that had to be like, this is weird and I don't love it, I want to do something beyond Sheena.
Right, exactly. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I think I even mentioned that somewhere in the book, how each one of these artists, it seems like, were basically a slap in the face type of characters, where
right,
you always had the white jungle god, or you had the white jungle princess or something like that, and they were drawing these stories. Every single one of them ended up drawing stories like that, whether it was Robert Pius or Matt Baker or Hollingsworth. And again, it's all goes back to that dual identity thing. Like somehow they were able to separate themselves, even though they knew it was a racist presentation that they were, depicting. They were able to do it. And I guess, having to eat makes you do a lot of things. It'll make you accept a lot of crap.
And when you try to do like Hollingsworth did or maybe did with Bronze Man, it's like, okay, we're not going to have it be what you might think it might be or want it to be.
Well, I think sometimes they did some things subtly. I just happened to notice yesterday, somebody posted on some site the front cover to Rocket Kelly #3. Okay, I wish I had it for you, to show you there. And what it is, it's a E.C. Stoner Fox comic, basically nothing special comic. But what it is, it depicts the Earth and a rocket ship taking off and launching from the Earth. Okay, but what's interesting, the rocket ship is taking off from Africa. Why Africa? You would think they would take off from the United States or Europe or something. It's taking off from Africa. And it's very obviously Africa because it's front and center right there on the globe of the earth where it's launching from. And that to me was, a very subtle thing by Stoner.
Yeah.
I just wonder how many other things were done like that. Check it out sometime.
A little Wakanda precursor or something like that.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And another thing I liked, I think it was, Stoner's relationship with Walter Gibson. That was kind of cool.
Yeah, it was. And again, they had this working relationship, but I don't know how close they really were because in things I read from Walter Gibson, he talks about this colored guy he worked with, and even though he wasn't that good an artist and stuff like that, but they worked together, off and on for a number of years,
right?
Through Street and Smith, stuff they did with Blackstone Comics,
right?
And then they did this, this comic strip. But Stoner ended up getting fired from the comic strip because of his artwork. They didn't like his artwork, and they hired Walter Johnson, who was a white artist. He ended up suing him, as a matter of fact, over it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that reminds me of a question I had. Charlie Frederick. Is that the name? Who is the artist that was friends with Hollingsworth, worked with Hollingsworth? Charles Frederick? Charles, do you know who I'm talking about?
Oh, you're talking about not Charles Allen?
Not Charles Allen. No, Charles Frederick.
Charles Frederick.
And I mean,
no, you got me there, Jim. That's
no, I am famous for getting it's probably some other.
Oh, he had a friend named Al. Al Sargent. He worked with.
Not that far off. It's okay. We'll
Charles Quinlan.
That was early on.
Yeah, at Holyoke.
No, wait, who's that?
Charles Quinlan, which he worked at Holyoke.
Alex, you're going to talk about the tremendous reception to the book and New York Times coverage and things. I'll be back in a second. I'll have the person.
So tell us how it's been, the reception, Ken, to your book. It's gotten a lot of coverage, and I'm loving seeing that because it's putting almost what was originally could have been viewed as esoteric material front and center culturally. What do you think that means as far as the current audience and the current reception you're getting?
I hope it means that more people be interested and want to read more, about comics history in general. I think timing has a lot to do with it. I think the subject matter has a lot to do with it, because of race being so front and center right now. But I've gotten a lot of emails and texts from people who've never read anything about comics history, and they didn't. They're thanking me for exposing them to it, which I think is really cool. Because it said, "Wow, I never realized that comic books had such an interesting history to it."
Right.
I got this Times article today that has published something here in the Detroit Free Press, which is the largest newspaper in Detroit, as a large article. And actually, I got another interview I gave to a West Coast chain of newspapers that's going to be published in the next couple of days. And so a lot of people are reading this stuff now. And to me, that's really exciting. Not so much for me, because I don't really care. I'm not that ego driven, to worry about that.
Right. Yeah, I know that you don't like your picture taken. You don't want to be out there visually. You want the work to stand for itself.
Exactly.
But it is nice to see your face and to see it talking. But no, it is, and also the passion and the research you've done. It really. You can see it in how you discuss it. It is a real pleasure. It is a real pleasure to see it in action, verbally and visually. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks. Well, like I said, I'll talk about comics all day, 24 hours a day if I could. It's something I've been doing for 60 years, and it's kind of weird for me in a way to see comics come to such prominence during my lifetime from where it started. I mean, for the longest time, comic fans were ostracized and made fun of. And, to see comics getting the respect that they are nowadays and discussed seriously, it warms my heart, to hear that. It's just a really satisfying sort of thing. And if I can help with that, that makes it even better as far as I'm concerned. I just hope that there's more books like this published, and not by me. I'm just talking about, there's so many guys out there who have things that, it should be, put forth. There's so much great research that's been done over the years. And I just hope that there's a market for it, that they see that there is a market for this kind of stuff. More publishers take a chance, because publishing, I understand, is a tough business. These guys got to, there's a lot of, they take a big risk every time they publish a book.
Right. Just the print runs alone. And then also this whole, the COVID world, how does that equate to selling at a bookstore or a comic store, or any sort of physical place? This gets pretty strange, actually. And it might all be online sales for a while.
Yeah. Well, like I say, it's weird for me to watch. Like I check Amazon every day, and I keep seeing the books sell out. And I go like, what happened to the books? Is that good or bad? Are there going to be more published? There are going to be more published. They guaranteed me of that, but it's just strange, to even think of that somebody's reading something I've written. It's.
So
I've always written for me. I mean, that's when he says, like, who do you write for? And I basically write for me. It's what I like to do.
In a way, it's how you kind of gather your info, kind of make notes for yourself, post it.
Exactly.
And it's almost your own mechanism of kind of jotting your notes down in a way.
Right. I don't know if you guys noticed, but a lot of times, especially with my post, it's almost the way I talk. I talk very much the same way I write. And, it's almost like a stream of consciousness kind of thing. And since comics are what I do almost 24 hours a day, I mean, being retired, I literally spend almost all day involved with comics in one way or another. And that's why I just try to share it as much as I can.
I had a different voice in my head, just so you know. I'm going to have to, I have to reconcile this. I'm not sure how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to have to reconcile that.
I don't know if you get to call yourself retired when you're out promoting your book
I know, it's bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah,
I know. I'm supposed to be sitting out on a patio sipping a Long Island iced tea or something.
A little marmalade and bread.
Yeah, there you go. I don't know.
Name I said, Charles what? Does
Charles Quinlan was the guy that I threw out.
Huh?
You said Frederick.
Oh,
yeah. You said Frederick.
Charles Ferguson.
Ferguson. Oh yeah, Charles Ferguson. Yeah. What about him now? What was the question?
Well, he popped up a lot in the Hollingsworth chapter, and I wondered. I guess I was using him as an emphasis to say the ones that are here in the book are not the only black by any stretch.
By no means. And see, that's also the thing that's frustrating to me personally, because the only criticism I've had so far is, hey, why didn't you include so-and-so? Or why didn't you say such and such about a person? And, when you write a book, they only allow you so many pages. It started out, I was only allowed 200 pages, to do this book. And Craig realized early on, there's no way in the world you're going to be able to include as much as you want with 200 pages. So he got IDW, who's over reaching publisher, to agree to knock it up to first 225 and then 250 pages, for unproven author in a book, which was really, going out on a limb. And I really appreciate that. But this book easily could have been twice as long, if not longer. And somewhere down the line, I hope somebody will, willing to take a chance and let me do a second volume to it, because there's so much more I want to say, and there's so many other artists involved who I left out. I mean, like Warren Broderick is one, I didn't include in the first volume because I didn't know that much at the time. I've since learned a lot more because I constantly keep doing this research. E. Harper Johnson, Tom Feelings are all three artists who should, definitely be included, because they all did a significant amount of work in the 1950s. I've recently learned that there's a couple other artists who worked in comics who I can't even find any credits for them anywhere in comic books, but I know they worked in comics. I have an article, matter of fact, I was going to put it online the next day or so, about an artist named Bill Curry. He talks about being a comic book artist for 5 years in the 1950s, And I don't know of any Bill Curry who worked in comic books in the 1950s. And yet he wrote an entire article about it in a black newspaper. So this is the kind of stuff that I deal with a lot of times is you got this one clue and you have to try to build a biography from this one crumb of information that you have. And that's what I've been doing for the past 20 years. And that's what I hope to do, expand upon it from, what I had in the first volume and expand on from like 1950 going forward.
Well, I hope you do another one and not take 25 years because this.
No, I don't think I'll make another 25 years. I'm 68 right now and I'm pushing it. Okay. So,
any tie-up questions?
No, but I do want to thank you for your time. I know you're a busy guy and you have a lot of interview offers and such, and I'm really glad you chose to spend today with us. It was a huge pleasure. I've long time been a fan of your research, and I'm really glad that you put this book together and really solidified this story. And I got so much out of it, not just of the Black involvement in early comics, but also just on the origins of various things and the context historically that you put. Just the whole Philadelphia Museum of Art just by itself is its own fascinating story. So right. I really appreciate the time you gave us here at the Comic Book Historians Podcast, Ken. Thank you.
Well, thank you for asking me, you guys. I really appreciate you asking me.